right, this is OpenStax U.S. History, Chapter 14, Section 3, the Dred Scott Decision and Sectional Strife. So we're focusing on the years from 1850 to 1860 and all of the conflicts that occurred in that decade, ultimately leading up to 1860, which is the start of the Civil War. So we've already talked about things like the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. We've talked about things like Bleeding Kansas. Another very important kind of piece of this puzzle was a Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott Decision, which only inflamed and created a wider division between both the North and the South. So the Supreme Court case was called Dred Scott versus Sandford. It was ruled in 1857, so we're not too far away from the Civil War here. Dred Scott was a slave living in free territory. So his owner had originally been in Missouri, which was a slave state, but he moved with Dred Scott into free territory. And the question was, does this make Scott, because he had lived in free territory, does it make him free? And that potential, that is essentially the question. So Dred Scott sues, and it eventually makes its way up to the Supreme Court, right? And the Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney, is more or less, he's a Southern slaveholder. So he has, we might say, he's much more of a pro-Southern position, although I believe he did manumit his slaves, but he certainly represents kind of a Southern Supreme Court. Certainly the Supreme Court would be described by the North as being in compliance with what they called slave power, that is the political power of the slave states. And when this case got before the Supreme Court, it took a little while, it took a couple years, but there was more than just the original question. Again, the original question was, should Dred Scott be free because he had lived on free soil? Other questions before the Supreme Court also became was, are Black citizens? In other words, does Dred Scott, as a Black person, as a person of African descent, does he even have the right to petition the court? Is he protected those rights? And the second question, or the third question, is, does Congress have the power to ban slavery, right? Does Congress have the authority, the constitutional authority, to ban slavery in the territories, which it did via the Missouri Compromise? And in this ruling, again, is Dred Scott free? Are people of African descent citizens? Does Congress have the power to ban slavery? Chief Justice Robert Taney in the Supreme Court ruled against the North on all three counts. So this is three rulings in favor of the slave power. So is Dred Scott still a slave? Yes. Can Africans or can Blacks be citizens? No. I mean, it is a very clear ruling that citizenship is for whites. And this was, not just for Dred Scott. This was for all Black people in the United States, and not just slaves. This was for free Blacks who lived in the South and the North, essentially shutting the door to citizenship. People like Frederick Douglass, who had hoped that the United States would live up to its potentially its promise of treating all men equal. This ruling more or less shut the door on that. And lastly, and this is really what got a lot of congressmen in the North riled up, you could say, was that the Chief Justice ruled that Congress has no power to prohibit slavery. In other words, this idea that popular sovereignty would be the law of the land, this was unconstitutional. You cannot deny somebody, you cannot deny a slaveholder their property if they wanted to move into free territory. So again, this was all ruled by the Supreme Court, all of them ruling in favor of slave power. And it was this Dred Scott decision that proved to be the backdrop behind the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So this was a debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. We've mentioned Stephen Douglas before, but not Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln at this time had been involved a little bit into politics when he came out in opposition of the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, but worked primarily as a lawyer. He was someone who originally was born in the slave state of Kentucky and moved to the free state of Illinois. A lot of white families moved to free soil because of the economic opportunity that was there. His family was like that. Came from very humble origins, taught himself how to read and write, became involved in politics, became a lawyer, and re-entered politics when Kansas, Nebraska came about, and supported the Republican. Even though he had been a member of the Whig Party before, became a supporter of the Republican Party, which was the new party which was against Kansas, Nebraska. Now, this was just for a local election for a Senate seat. So this was a Senate election. And of course, Stephen Douglas, everybody knows Stephen Douglas. He created the Compromise of 1850. He created the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which of course is infamous. He's known as the Little Giant. He's probably the most famous politician in the country. Lincoln, he's an unknown. Nobody knows who this guy is. And that really is what the significance of the debates are, is that the Lincoln-Douglas debates makes Lincoln a national figure. People become familiar who this guy is. Everybody tunes in to watch Stephen Douglas, right? And when he's debating Abraham Lincoln, they're saying, oh, well, I really like what this guy Abraham Lincoln has to say. And every time they would debate for this local election, the issue of slavery would be brought up, and you'd have these two different sides, Stephen Douglas representing kind of a position of compromise, and Abraham Lincoln presenting the position of anti-slavery. And really where Lincoln's appeal was that he could articulate an anti-slavery message that could be, understood by the masses. He talked a lot about the idea, where's Abraham Lincoln, as slavery being maybe antithetical to American values. He used the idea of the Declaration of Independence and said that, if those words are actually true, then slavery can't exist. Otherwise, the United States contradicts itself. Stephen Douglas and the Democrats, hurled various, critiques of him, one of them being miscegenation, which was the idea of interracial marriage and offspring, playing on people's racial fears. Yes, slavery was illegal in the North. Slavery was illegal in Illinois. This is a free state, which makes it makes it all the more perplexing why they're talking about slavery so much, because they're not talking about slavery as it pertains to Illinois. They're talking about slavery as it pertains to what's going on in the whole country, right? Bleeding Kansas and, the caning of Sumner and the Dred Scott decision, right? These things are all huge national issues. And every single time they go on to debate, they end up on this issue of slavery. Stephen Douglas, again, plays on people's racial fears and racial prejudices, because even though Illinois is a free state, you still have a lot of racial prejudice in the North. And, saying that the Republican Party is, the black Republicans, a vote for the white man is a vote for the Democrats, a vote for the black man is a vote for the Republicans. And again, Lincoln is able to kind of create a response to these sort of fear tactics in a way that has a mass appeal. Again, sort of going back to this point. Okay, Stephen Douglas, well, do you believe the American do you believe the Declaration of Independence to be true, or don't you? And if you're an American, then you have to say that slavery can't exist. Lincoln gives one of his most famous speeches during these debates. It's called "A House Divided," in which he says, "A house divided cannot stand. It's either going to be all one thing or all another," or something like that, right? And of course, what he's talking about is that he's saying, look, the nation can't exist the nation can't exist half slave and half free. It's either going to become all free or it's either going to become all slave. And of course, this speech is, at the time, this was before the Civil War, but it was eerily predictable in what eventually ended up happening. Stephen Douglas' position is the Freeport Doctrine, which states that popular sovereignty must rule the day. But what's happening with some of Douglas's supporters is that, they're moving away popular sovereignty to this position, right? Lincoln makes it very clear. It says, look, either the entire United States is going to be free or the entire United States is going to be slave. There's no middle ground. Stephen Douglas is still trying to find this middle ground where he says, look, as long as the people vote, then it's okay. And ultimately, when this election was held for the Senate seat, Stephen Douglas ended up being the winner. So Lincoln lost this election. And in fact, if you just look at Lincoln's political record, he's, one for three, I believe. He's ran for election 3 times. He's lost twice. So he's not a political winner. But again, it's the fact that he made a national name for himself that puts him in position to run for president just 2 years later.